Abraham is also known as Ibrahim in the Islamic tradition, and he's universally revered in all three Abrahamic traditions. And the Abrahamic traditions being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So what makes Islam Abrahamic? Okay, yeah, and Abraham is mentioned both in the Quran and in the Bible extensively. So Abraham's monotheism, just a quick recap. I know you all know about Abraham, but so he was born into a family of staunch polytheists and idolaters. This is the Quranic narrative of Abraham. He's persecuted by his people for his disbelief in their idols and his belief in the one God. So there are numerous verses in the Quran that talk about his struggle with his people, and that his father was from the nobles of that particular community. So he eventually leaves Iraq and goes to Egypt and Syria, Palestine, so on and so forth. And he has two wives, Sarah and Hagar. Okay. So I do want to emphasize the importance of Sarah and Hagar, because oftentimes we hear the story of Prophet Abraham from a male-centric perspective, but we don't see the perspective that centralizes the role of these two matriarchs. Abraham has progeny who bear witness to his monotheism. So he has children who are monotheists as he is. And Sarah and Hagar are two matriarchs. And Sarah's descendants, so the children that Abraham and Sarah have, include both the biblical and Quranic prophets such as Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Jesus. And Abraham and Hagar's descendants include the prophet Ismail or Ishmael and the prophet Muhammad. The Quranic narrative views Sarah positively. So Sarah is never criticized or spoken of in a way that is negative in any way at all. And neither are any of her children. The prophets that come from the Israelites are regarded as also prophets within the Islamic tradition, Islam being monotheism and the worship of one God. And you'll see Muslims will commonly name their children after names of biblical prophets that are also Quranic prophets. So you'll see Muslims with the name of Ishaq, Isaac, Joseph, Yusuf, Jacob, Yaqub, Jesus, Isa. So this indicates how central these figures are, both within not just the biblical tradition, but also the Islamic tradition, and that Muslims regard them very positively. There's no mention of Sarah being jealous, for instance. That's not in the Islamic narrative. It's God who commands Abraham to leave Hagar in Mecca. And her infant son, Hagar and her son in Mecca, because God has a plan for them. So eventually, Abraham takes his son and Hagar and leaves them there. So the narrative of Hagar within the Islamic tradition, she's a strong woman. She has strength and conviction. When Abraham leaves her in the Arabian Peninsula in Mecca, in the Bible it's Becca, where when Abraham leaves her there, she asks him, "Did God command you to do this?" And he says, "Yes." And she says, "If God commanded you to do this, then he will not leave us." Now, a lot of people will say the story and kind of overlook Hagar's response, but the fact that she had herself had such strong faith in God, and that she was that she's portrayed in this way with such conviction, it's important and it's significant, especially when we're trying to bring a narrative to these stories that also centralizes women's experiences. So knowing that God has commanded her to be there with her son, she goes back and forth between, the narrative is that she goes back and forth between the mountains of Safa and Marwa, searching for life or water. And at that point, a well springs up, and because they're able to find water, people are able to settle in the area. And Hagar becomes a powerful matriarch, and this also becomes a pilgrimage ritual for Muslims. So this is one of the, it's a rite that was started by this woman, this matriarch, that Muslim men and women perform and follow and remember when they do the Hajj rituals. So, and a lot of scholars will comment on this, Muslims who think about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. They'll comment on this saying, this is one of many examples in the life of the Prophet or the biography of the Prophet where Muslims take from it a lesson of the importance of believing in God, putting one's faith in God, but at the same time working and doing one's best to come out with a result. So sometimes people will just believe in God and say God will take care of everything, and other times some people will just think everything comes out from our own actions and that God doesn't play a role. But we'll see this here and we'll see this elsewhere, how Muslims comment on these parts of the Prophet Muhammad's life and as prophetic examples of balancing faith and action. So Ismail is not an Arab as the son of Abraham, but he marries into one of the Arab tribes in the region. So his descendants become known as Arabized Arabs. So there are the original Arabs and the Arabized Arabs. So he's known as Musta'riba, or an Arabized Arab. It's just some of the affiliations, tribal affiliations that were known in that time. So Ismail is both in the Bible and in the Quran. In the Bible, I've included some verses here for us to look at. Blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, in whose heart are the ways of them who passing through the valley of Becca make it a well. So Becca becomes later known as Mecca. And this well is called the Well of Zamzam. Another verse here, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. And then in the Quran, recall the time when Abraham prayed, saying, "Lord, make this city a city of peace, and protect me and my descendants from the worship of idols. Lord, these have turned away," he's referring to his people, "these have turned away many people from the right way, and they might turn away my descendants as well. Therefore, only those of them who follow my way belong to me. But I leave to thee those who follow a different way from mine, for thou art very forgiving and merciful. Lord, I have settled some of my descendants in the barren valley near thy sacred house." The sacred house is the Kaaba, this blue cube temple, which is in Mecca. "Lord, I have done this in the hope that they would establish prayer there. So turn the hearts of the people towards them and provide fruits for their food." And this is in what's known as the chapter of Ibrahim 14:35 through 37. And I've only given you guys a few samples here just so you can get the gist. But if you're interested in both biblical and Quranic portrayals of Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, that's something that you can continue to research. Any questions so far? I like questions, by the way. So if you have a question, stop me, raise your hand. I do like questions. Yes?
You didn't talk much about where Hagar came from.
Hagar. So there are different narrations on that in the Islamic tradition. In the biblical tradition, she's known to be a slave servant of Sarah. In the Islamic tradition, there is dispute over that. Now, the question then is, well, was then Ismail an illegitimate child of Abraham? That's a valid question, but we tend to project modern sensibilities onto 3000 BC. And at that time, a woman living in in Abraham's household would have had the status of a wife, and the child would not be considered illegitimate. The child is considered as his own. Even historically, you'll be taking some, I don't know, maybe you've started Islamic history with Dr. Michaud. You'll see that within the Islamic tradition, children born out of mothers who may have been slaves are free, and that they're considered equal to children born from wives. I mean, that was just the reality of that time. Today, that's a bit weird, but that's just how life was in 3000 BC. Yeah.
Can we assume that
she
was from Egypt?
She was from Egypt, yeah.
That she and Abraham was from the Fertile Crescent, from the Iraq area.
Yeah.
That Ismail was a mix of like the.
Was she like? I mean, she was from Africa.
Sumerian. He was.
Yeah.
Can we say Ibrahim was Sumerian, or that she was Ethiopian, and so that Ismail was a mix of this?
She wasn't Ethiopian. I've read that she was Coptic, so that those Copts are in southern Egypt, but they're distinct from the Abyssinians, the Ethiopians. The truth is, we don't really know with certainty what their ethnicity was. We know which geographic regions they came from, but what was their race, what was their complexion. Again, these are things that we often, as in the modern period, is really important. But in that time, people were of many colors and they lived together, and they didn't really distinguish each other based on those characteristics or identities. They had different identities through which they characterized themselves.